Okay, so to sort of continue on a few more concrete examples of the sort of grammar of graphics idea that we mentioned before, with this, the slides that we covered where we had the example where you have sort of the input, then the mapping, and then the points or the graphics that you actually draw, and then the axes, and then the annotations. This is sort of how it actually looks as our source code. And so you have the ggplot function, which you call. This is then your input data, because of course your data has to come from somewhere. And then this AES is the mapping. And so you basically say the first axis is x1, so this x1 vector we want to show, so that maps to the x-axis. The second is y1, and the color is equal to this class. And so we showed the table before. We have x1, y1 in class. And what we want to show for each element in this graphic is a point. And so it generates a point based on this. And then this is just the theme, so you can kind of ignore that at the moment. But that's then the graphic that you produce. You can then divide the data into different groups where you now have each sort of a new characteristic for each point, this data division. So does it belong to training, validation, or testing? You can then plot it with the same function you had before, where you have an additional mapping with the shape and the color. And so this can go here for the point, it can also go back here. But the idea is that you have sort of your graph built up so that you can add new things to it quite easily, and that your visualization point is independent from how you actually choose to show it. You can then add labels afterwards. So we want to call shape type instead of data div, because data div is not a very nice name, and so then it shows up here as type. You can then see sort of a further version of this where you then want to show this predictive map that you've come up with. And you have x mapping to x1, y mapping to y1. And now you want to use tiles, so these large sort of tile objects that you have here, to show what class it predicted in each area. And then you want to show your training data as points on top of it. And so you can use this to make fairly complicated graphs as well by just sort of stacking things up. And yeah, throughout the entire lecture you have examples of this, so if you're curious about how you do any of these specific problems in R or ggplot, you can see the approach here. So to go. Okay, so now to go to the slides that we were supposed to cover today. This is then on the sort of dynamic experiments. There's quite a bit of extra material associated with this that I'd recommend looking into, because there are a huge number of different tools available here, and we just cover a small fraction of them. And so it's more about getting aware with being aware of what's available and understanding the problem well enough to sort of influence your experimental design and those sort of aspects in the scientific part. So we can skip sort of the first parts. And now the objectives are sort of looking at kind of what sort of dynamic experiments do you have? How can you design these experiments well? And so when you're doing these experiments, you always have a trade-off, or at least with most cameras or visualization tools, you have a trade-off with how big of a region you can measure and how fast you can measure it. So if you want to measure a really small region, you can measure it 100 million times a second. And if you're trying to measure a whole image, you might only be able to measure it 1,000 times. Or if you're looking at a 3D image, then maybe twice a second. And so deciding how much information you need to incorporate will determine how you design this experiment and what sort of aspects you need to focus on. The next part is sort of how do we track objects between points and sort of the related tasks. So how can you track shape? How can you look at something like distribution and see how that changes, and where is that a useful tool to use? How can you track topology? And then shifting over to kind of the other side of how do you track voxels. And so rather than focusing on objects, how do you track parts or pieces of objects as they move around? And how can you look at things like deformation and strain inside of these images? Finally, there's the last, where how can you assess a really more generic case where you don't necessarily know at the beginning what to expect, and you don't want to impose this sort of either mechanical model with deformation and strain, or this object-based model where you have sort of fixed objects that are continuously evolving in time. So these are sort of the outlines of things we'll go over. The first aspect is really the idea for experiments, and then the tools that we developed to analyze these experiments and sort of what is available, from cross-correlation to nearest neighbor mapping to some of these other approaches, and then some examples on sort of real challenging tracking problems that we've solved and what tools we use to analyze them. So hopefully this one doesn't, but this one does. So 3D movies can be quite difficult to visualize, and so if you remember from the first lecture, we have this video of this foam sort of evolving in real time, and I think it's external figures. Or here's another example that fits quite well. So if you look at this structure changing, you can see that something's happening. Maybe, I mean, clearly the volume fraction is getting higher, but it starts off with a very small amount of whatever the material is, and with time it gets higher and higher. But to try to make a meaningful assessment of this by just looking at it would be next to impossible. 2D images can also be quite challenging, and so this is an example of, I think, a high-speed stream of dust that we did at the SLS. And so you can see there are things there that are moving kind of quickly, but there's also lots of noise, and just watching this video would make it really difficult for you to assess something like how fast are those objects moving. Is it a continuous flow? Are there lots of variations? Are there variations in size and structure and shape? And so trying to analyze that by just looking at it would not be very easy to do. And so what we want to do is sort of the same things that we've done this entire lecture, are being able to extract the quantitative information from data sets like this, so we can say, you know, quantitatively, how fast is it going? How many particles are present? What's sort of the total volume flux going through here? Are the sizes changing? Is there sort of a uniform speed, or are they lots of different speeds? And kind of how are they moving? Is it structured? Are they rearranging? Are there some sort of rules that we can figure out from looking at this data? And so if we kind of look at the scientific goals of what we have here, rheology is kind of one of the major areas. It's understanding the flow of liquids and mixtures. And so if you're studying blood movement in arteries, veins, and capillaries, this is very important because you need to understand how these fluids move and how sort of the surfaces cause them to slow down or block up. Oil movement through porous rock. And so if you're a company like Shell, they invest a huge amount researching how oil moves through porous rock because they're trying to extract it. And so they use different techniques for sort of adding pressure and adding different substances so that this oil moves better through porous rock. And they also want to understand which rocks it can move through well and which rocks it can't, because if you have a huge oil well that's surrounded by rocks where oil can't penetrate through well, you won't be able to extract it easily. And so being able to figure out what kind of rocks are there and if it makes sense to build a well or not is very important. For more sort of practical applications, you have sort of the entire food science group, which is just one building across from us, where they look at things like dough or chocolate as it's being produced and how bubbles inside of these structures change the final properties of the structure. And so for things like bread, this is fairly well understood. But if you look at kind of the new trends, I guess, in food science, having things that are gluten-free and vegan and don't include sort of a lot of the things that people are allergic to or don't want to have in their substances, it can become quite challenging. So how do you make bread or a pretzel without gluten that still tastes good or is edible? And that's not very easy. The same thing of how do you make a piece of meat without any meat that still tastes good. And so understanding how this moves and how it flows is very important for optimizing these kind of structures, because their static presence isn't very interesting. You're interested in when you start chewing on it or you're trying to transport it, what changes. Finally, for sort of a more danger or high risk scenario, when you're looking at volcanoes in different areas, what causes them to erupt, how does the pressure build up, and how does sort of the magma and gas flow, and how is it released? And understanding these is very important for being able to assess the risk of a specific volcano and try to determine where or what is going to happen when it eventually erupts. Because if you can make these predictions, then you can evacuate people much more strategically and come up with different strategies for that. Deformation is sort of similarly important, and it's kind of a separate area from pure rheology. And so this is where you're looking at sort of how things are being changed with time. And so to go back to sort of the blood example, that if you're looking at sort of red blood cell lysis, so what causes the red blood cells to break in an artificial heart valve, that you can then study, what are the deformations that are being applied to the cell as it goes around it, and how is that different than a normal situation, and how can you minimize the amount of deformations that's taking place there. In bone, you have lots of microfractures in your bones, particularly when you go running or on pavement. You can build up a lot of these microfractures, and most of them heal normally, but some of them sort of join together to form stress fractures or more serious injuries. And how does this happen? And how can you sort of predict which ones of these are going to be very serious and which ones will not be? Finally, for things like wood structures, if you can understand toughening, and so those are some of the mechanical properties that you get out, that will help you choose better woods to build furnitures and houses that will then last longer and be less likely to fail when there's too much snow on the roof or something like that. And so the first part of this is really how do we come up with a proper experimental design to extract these parameters well. And so there's always kind of a trade-off between voxel size, image resolution, the rate we can acquire data, the amount of data we can store, the time it takes to process it. And so it's ideal to come up with what kind of information we need to get, and if we're actually able to measure the things we're trying to measure in the data. And so, a lot of measuring techniques will damage the original sample. And so if you measure too quickly, you'll damage it before you actually see the effect you want. But if you measure too slowly, then the effect will happen without you ever having a chance to see it. The same sort of thing with too high or too low resolution. It makes it very difficult to see what's going on, because if you have too high resolution, you won't see sort of the large shifts. And if you have too low resolutions, then you won't see a lot of the small different changes. So understanding what you see in the system and what it's actually possible to track is quite important to come up with these experiments well that let you understand these data sets. Cool. And so this is where simulation really comes in very helpfully. And so with these experiments, it can be very difficult or costly, or sometimes you can only do the experiments once. And so having simulation tools that let you see what the results of the experiments are or could be and try to analyze them makes the task of designing the experiments and choosing what you want to measure much easier. And so particularly with these sort of dynamic analyses that we'll cover, you can figure out sort of what is the least resolution or the least temporal resolution that you need in order to track the changes that you want to be able to track. And so you can avoid doing too much damage, or you can see as much of the sample as possible because you've established sort of this boundary condition. So we kind of look at what tools we start with. We've built up over a large number of lectures, kind of a collection of tools that we can use to analyze these images. And now we want to do something meaningful with it over time. And so how can we take all of these different tools and combine them together to analyze some of these dynamic experiments? And so what we do is we start off with a very basic simulation, which is the sort of things we'll work with in the exercises, where you have a number of spherical objects with the same radius scattered evenly across the field of view. So this is a very simplified model. Of course, almost all real systems will be more complicated than this, but you have some data set that looks like that. And so now what you want to do is you can do sort of your standard analysis where you threshold connected component labeling, shape analysis, distribution analysis to describe this image well. The next step is then adding motion or adding some kind of dynamic process to this. And so the simplest would be, okay, there's simply this uniform, homogeneous displacement vector that we apply where all of the samples move up 0.1. And so you can sort of show it on your original image. You can also then move beyond that to look at more complicated flows. And so here you can have it sort of a twisting flow where it's a cross product between the position vector and this z vector. And you get this flow around in your image. And I think there's a couple other examples that we have. So rather than just having one image, you have a whole series of images. And so here you see going from time 0 to time 1.25, if you apply this constant vector, what the image or how the image changes with each step. And so you go from the original image to the final image, and you can very easily see in the system what's going on. And you know exactly what sort of trend or displacement you've applied. And so you have this perfect ground truth knowledge about what you're trying to track. That you know that this point is exactly the same, or this point is exactly the same as this one. It might look a little bit different because there's sort of rounding errors or things like that, but you know that they should match up together. And so you can check to see if whatever tracking or if whatever analysis you're applying gives you that result. And so this is very difficult in actual experimental conditions because you don't always know what maps up to what. And so that's why you want to have these sort of synthetic or simulated environments where you can be confident that's what happened because you applied the transformation yourself. Similarly with the swirl, that you kind of go from a very well-oriented structure to kind of this messy structure, but you know exactly which regions match up to which regions because you know that this pixel in the original image is this pixel in the final image. And if you were just to look at the original and the final image, you might not be able to guess that. But if you know exactly what transformations applied, then it's very simple. It's trivial. Another thing that you can add, which actually is quite frequently used in sort of machine learning and deep learning as well, is sort of this random appearance and disappearance. And so you can randomly kind of remove objects and add objects in. So in machine learning, this idea is called dropout, where you sort of randomly remove features or add features in. And here we just call it the random appearance and disappearance of objects. And so basically, you have a flow like this, and each frame you show different objects inside the frame. And so you could do this on an object, or you could do this on a pixel basis. But to kind of simulate the effect that not all of your objects will always be found in every image. And so when you're doing this tracking, you want to be sure that having an object disappear once doesn't completely ruin your ability to fully analyze the image. The next thing is kind of jitter or motion noise that you add to the images. And so here it's kind of this random magnitude and angle that you add to each point. And so you can then see how this image sort of changes when you do that. And instead of being in a perfect grid, your points move out of a perfect grid very quickly. It's also helpful for kind of avoiding these symmetries that you have when you use a perfect lattice for all of your analysis, that you can have things that are a little bit offset from that. And so you could actually have a flow that's just a jitter. So there's actually no uniform flow, just the points move around and get further and further away from their original point as time goes on, but without having sort of an average trend or an average direction. So sort of a Brownian. And so here, you can represent these simulations a little bit easier when you then show for each point that you have in the original image how it moves with time. So here, it has a constant offset with some jitter involved, but the offset's clearly much bigger than the jitter. So there's sort of limits that you come into with this sort of tracking, and even visually, this can be quite difficult. And so what we want to establish are sort of what are the parameters or what are the boundary conditions for tracking well. And the basic ones that are important in the sort of rheology examples are the flow rate, the flow type, the density, the appearance and disappearance, jitter, and how unique the particles are. And so what you want to be able to do is establish what are the limits of your ability to track based on sort of these given conditions, so that you can see, first of all, how well can you track with a very simple approach? How much does it help you to use a more complicated approach, like some of these multiple hypothesis testing and other sorts of analyses? And how confident can you be that your tracking in your final data actually match up to something meaningful? And so if we mapped this back to our experiments, that sort of your acquisition rate is going to map very well to your kind of flow rate and jitter per frame. And so here we talk about flow rate not in the sense of volume per second, but sort of how fast in a pixel sense are your images moving. And so if you can acquire very fast, then your effective flow rate between two images goes down, because your two time steps are very close to each other and the amount it moves is very small. Similarly, resolution will affect then density and appearance and disappearance rate. And so if your resolution is very coarse, then your apparent density will be high, because you'll have a lot of objects that are close together and you won't have a lot of space or anything between them. And your appearance rate will be your disappearance appearance rate will be higher, because single voxels can switch much easier than whole groups of voxels. That if each object you're looking at has 1,000 points in it, then the likelihood that you'll have a whole object disappear is much lower. But if each object is just 2 pixels, the likelihood is much higher. Then from sort of the experimental parameters, that if you're looking at your experimental setup and you're doing a rheology experiment, you can usually control something like pressure. So if you have a gas tank that's forcing the flow to go through, you can decrease this pressure and this will change the flow rate. If you decrease it too much, it might even change the flow type. So you might move from something like a laminar flow where everything's moving consistently in the same direction to a much more disordered one. Polydispersity is also sort of an important factor. And so we saw with the examples that we had, all of the beads were the same size. And this made it easy for us to see the image, but it also means if the bead moves too much, it's hard to map it back to the original bead. And so this is really the particle uniqueness, that if you have a really large bead and there's only one of them in your whole system, then you can easily find where it went because you just look for another large object. But if all of them are exactly the same size, it can be much less clear what went where. Similarly, things like vibration or temperature can affect this amount of jitter. And so if you cool down your mixture substantially, you can get less of this. And then how you actually mix it, so how much water or sort of solvent you add to the mixtures you're looking at will affect this density or this observed density that you have. So if we look at kind of the very simplest tracking approach that we have, it's this nearest neighbor. So it's the same tool that we looked at before when we were trying to analyze these structures, but now we use it to track. And so you say, rather than looking for the nearest neighbor in the same image, you look at the nearest neighbor in image 1, or you take an object in image 1 and you look for its nearest neighbor in image 2. And so it's quite simple. It's just going from this image 0 to image 1 and finding the shortest distance between them, and then that's the mapping that you have. So then what you have is you need a way of sort of score tracking. And so this nearest neighbor we've done right now just based on Euclidean distance. So what's the xy coordinate of the center of mass of your first point, and what's the xy coordinate of the point in the second image, and how close they are together. But this is a very simple metric, and maybe not always the most relevant metric for doing this analysis. And so what you can see is that coming up with a way of scoring your results is very important. And so do you score it by what's the distance away the objects are from each other, or do you score it from a perspective of how many, how different the particle size is, or one of these other factors? Again, a lot of the papers in the beginning cover this in much more detail, but it's important to have an idea of what the scoring criteria for you is. So now we can take sort of a basic simulation where we have this original flow. We have a very slow flow rate and a very small amount of jitter. And so we can see all of the different objects that we have and sort of the time course that they take. We can then apply nearest neighbor tracking, and we see that the tracking results we get match the data we had perfectly. And so the tracking algorithm did not know that these 2 points were part of the same object. It said they were part of the same object because they were closest together. And so we see here that it worked perfectly. So we got exactly the results we wanted to get. We can then take a more difficult flow, where here it's not moving as consistently in the same direction, and it has a much higher jitter. And so here we have our original sort of simulated results where we know that all of these are separate particles, and that's where they went. And then we can perform a tracking on this as well with nearest neighbor distances. And then you can see that it tracked all of them. Oh, in this case, it tracked all of them perfectly. And so there were no mistakes that it made, but it's getting more challenging. So it's getting closer to the limits of what it's possible to track. Yeah, so unfortunately, these data are randomly generated. And so I think before this time, this one had an example where the ones have some mismatches, but in this example, it happened to track perfectly. And so when you do these simulations, it's important to run them many times so that you see that it works in a lot of different situations and not just in the ones you test. Here. I mean, if that's a red circle, where? Here. Are they? I think it did okay. I think it matched it. But anyways, I think we'll have examples later of where it doesn't match. But you can see that as it starts to get more complicated, it gets more and more difficult to match. So before any meaningful tracking can be done, one of the important steps to take is this registration step. And this is making sure that the camera, the imaging setup, the sample that you're looking at are all registered in sort of the same system, so that you know that the 0 point on the axis refers to the same point in space. And so if you don't do that, trying to do all of the tracking steps afterwards can be not very meaningful. So now we can see where it starts to fail. So you can then take a more difficult tracking problem, and then you can see all of these red circles show where it missed or where it had a problem. And so here is a similar image to one we had before, but it's a little bit different. And so now you see all the points where it was not able to track perfectly the input data. Because again, we've fed the data into the system. We know which points went to which places in the image. And so we can calculate this miss rate very well. One of the ways we can look at it is to sort of count the misses. And so you can then show one of these graphics, how many misses do you have at each point? And see, do they all fall in the same region, or do different algorithms track it or do a better job of tracking in different places? And so the three ones we have right now are no offset, and so this is just nearest neighbor, a fixed offset, where you do nearest neighbor, assuming there's a small flow rate, so you know what this flow rate is, and then you try to match not where the point is in this image, but where the point would be if it was making this small flow in the next image. And the final one is this adaptive offset. So this is where you try to match everything in the first iteration, and then you take the average offset, and then you try to match it again. These are all very, very simple, primitive tracking methods, but you can have more complicated ones that take more information into account. The advantage of these is that they're very easy to understand, and so it's easy to interpret the results that you get out of it. Once you have more complicated methods, this can be much more difficult. So here you can see, you can quantify the tracking rate at each time in the image and see which method performed best. One of the things that we can start to see is that as we add jitter to the systems, how does this tracking work? And so how do the different methods compare with each other in this given system that we're analyzing? And so here what we did is we took a bunch of different simulations with different amounts of jitter, so different amounts of kind of this random fluctuation, and showed how well it tracked. And so we saw in the initial point, the no offset or the nearest neighbor model was at just above 80%. And as you increase the jitter, this drops down drastically. And so the fixed offset worked better, and the adaptive offset worked even better. But here there's clearly a limit that you get to at some point where it can't do that tracking very well anymore. You can then start to look at density and jitter, and so now you can make kind of three graphs at each point where you see different densities that you have, so how far are the objects spaced from each other, and then the jitter shown on the x-axis. And so here, the red curve are objects that are sort of close together, which means they're much more difficult to match well. And here, in the blue curve, the objects are very far apart. And so they're easier to match well because there's not any things that are crossing or overlapping, and so you don't have that challenge. Cool. And then you can kind of show, with a visualization where you show the color intensity, how these different techniques performed, where you see that for this, position jitter of 0, the no offset was able to do fairly well, but once this jitter gets higher, they fall down. Again, the fixed offset works a little bit better, and the adaptive offset works the best. So this helps us design experiments because it allows you to determine what the limits of your tracking are based on your experimental design and your simulations. And so you can then say how much your flow per frame, for example, needs to be so that you can do this tracking well. You can then estimate jitter from initial images where you do something like turn the flow off. And so it gives you a lot of information about how you can choose the parameters in your experimental design so that you get a good result out. And then you can start to measure, okay, this is what your error in your flow field is, this is what your error in your topology is, this is the error in your shape or volume, because all of these errors sort of propagate further. So yeah, you can extend this nearest neighbor even more. And so we talked about the offset and adaptive offset. That's sort of the simplest approach. You can also add something called the bijective requirement. And so this is where you say if it was tracked in the forward direction to this point, it has to be tracked in the backward direction to the same point. And so, if A is mapped to B, then B has to be mapped to A when you go in the reverse direction. And so then this gets rid of all the points which are sort of so close together that you can't tell which way they're flowing. You can also then add requirements sort of like the maximum displacement, where you say there's only so far a point could move in an image, independent of how close the other points are. Any other things that happen in the system, because you know in this amount of time, it's impossible that it moves over a certain distance. You can also choose maximums for other parameters, like a maximum volume change that can take place in a point, and then you can throw out a lot of these points, which so that your tracking works better. Yeah, you can add this sort of prior or expected movement, like we mentioned before, where you have sort of this V offset. You can then have this adaptive movement, where you calculate in an iterative fashion how much did the points move, and then use it as sort of a better guess for how the points move to try to get the best result out. You can then go way beyond nearest neighbor, so you can go to sort of this multiple hypothesis testing, and that's where you take each object and you sort of see how it could have moved, or all the possible movements it could have made, and rather than looking at just one frame to the next, you look at the whole time course, and you decide which of these time courses is the most realistic for that data set. And it gives you sort of the benefit of looking at all frames rather than a single frame. So it kind of takes into account things like momentum. So if an object's moving really fast in this direction, it's unlikely that it's moving really fast in the opposite direction in the next frame. It's probably sort of slowly changing. You then have sort of problems where, if you have something like merging and splitting particles, the nearest neighbor allows particles to sort of merge and split. You can map two particles to one and one to two, as long as you don't have the bijective requirement. But with the multiple hypothesis testing, you can't, because you're looking at all these hypotheses and you're making them sort of mutually exclusive. And so it's much more difficult to have things like merging and splitting incorporated into a method like that. That's where you really need to incorporate these more physically based models to encapsulate that behavior fully. Okay, so I think I'll stop there. The voxel-based approaches cover the same ideas, and we'll cover them again at the beginning of next lecture. And after that is just a few examples. So are there any questions on the pixel or the object-based approaches? Okay.
One interesting application, which I think across might just be in multiple sclerosis tracking lesions.
Yeah.
But just because you're showing differently, just put it out there. It's another thing that when the radiologist looks at an image